The history of Nazi Germany will not be complete without some ruthless women who stood firmly behind their husbands as they committed the biggest genocide in human history. From Emmy Göring, the First Lady of the Third Reich, to Briggite Frank, who stole fur and jewelry from the Polish people, and Lina Heydrich, who owned her own private collection of Jewish slaves, this is the story of the most dangerous Nazi wives and their fate after the end of the Second World War. Emmy Göring, the First Lady of the Third Reich. Out of the many women who had access to Hitler's inner courts, Emma Johanna Göring was one of the most notable. A German actress who became the second wife of the Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief, Hermann Göring, Emmy rose to a rank other Nazi women could only dream of at the time. Originally born Emma Johanna Henny Sonnemann in Hamburg, Germany, on March 24, 1893, Emmy's father was a wealthy salesman. Before she walked into the arms of the Nazi Party, she worked as an actress at the National Theater in Weimar. She was also initially married to Karl Köstlin back in 1916, but the marriage ended in divorce 10 years later, in 1926. After meeting and building a relationship with the prominent Basi and Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring, the two tied the knot on April 10, 1935, before the roars of World War II filled the air. Surprisingly, Göring didn't apply for Nazi membership by her own hands. Instead, she received an unsolicited membership as a Christmas gift in 1938. Earlier that year, on June 2nd, Emma and her husband welcomed their first daughter, Edda, named after the Countess Ed Ciano, Mussolini's eldest daughter. As the days of the Second World War rolled in, Emmy Göring served a major role as Hitler's personal hostess at many state functions. Her proximity to Nazi royalty, coupled with the fact that she married one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Nazi Germany, earned her the honor of First Lady of the Third Reich. This title was much coveted by many of the Nazi wives, and jealousy was not an uncommon thing in those days. However, the only problem with this title was that it created significant tension between herself and Ava Brown, Hitler's future wife. Everyone knew Emmy had little to no respect for Eva, and she would often snub and openly despise her. Hitler caught sight of this many times, and he would issue angry instructions to Hermann Göring, demanding that he called his wife to order. During the days of the Second World War, Emmy Göring lived like royalty, relishing in the wealth confiscated from the Jews. When her daughter was born, her husband celebrated by ordering 500 planes to fly over Berlin, and according to him, he would have flown 1,000 if it was a boy. But those days were soon gone with the wind, because after the war ended, she had to face the consequences in a German denazification court. Göring was convicted of being a Nazi and sentenced to serve 1 year in jail. Upon her release, 30% of her property was confiscated, and she was banned from the stage for 5 years. A couple of years after she was released, Göring secured a small flat in a building in Munich, where she stayed for the rest of her life. It was in Munich that she died on June 8, 1973, at the ripe age of 80. Magda Goebbels, Hitler's close friend. As powerful as Emmy Göring was, though, she wasn't the only First Lady of the Third Reich. Her competitor was also a woman of stature, Johanna Maria Magdalena Goebbels. Magda was the wife of Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Germany's propaganda minister, and a close ally, companion, and political supporter of Adolf Hitler. Young Magda was born in 1901 in Berlin to Augusta Behrendt and Oskar Ritschl, a building contractor and engineer. Her first marriage was to a rich German industrialist named Günther Quandt, who was twice her age at the time. The two met in 1920, while Magda was returning to school on a train, and he courted her with many grand gestures. They later got married on January 4, 1921, and had their first child, Harold, on November 1, 1921. But Magda soon grew frustrated with this marriage, since her husband was more concerned with expanding his business empire than spending time with her. The domestic issues reached a peak in 1929 when Magda's secret affair came to light, leading to a divorce later that year. Fast forward to 1930, and Marga decided to attend a meeting of the Nazi Party. It was there that she saw Joseph Goebbels address the people and was instantly blown away by him. On September 1st, 1930, Magda officially joined the Nazi Party, and she finally found a way into Goebbels' heart during a trip to Weimar in February 1931. As their relationship blossomed, so did Magda's influence in the Nazi Party, and before long, her flat on Theodor Heuss Platz became a favorite meeting place for Adolf Hitler and other officials of the NSDAP. However, this strange close relationship between Hitler and Magda didn't sit right with Goebbels, so much so that sometimes he couldn't hide his jealousy. But their relationship proceeded in spite of these issues, with the couple eventually sealing their union on December 19, 1931, Hitler himself being a witness. The close relationship between Magda and Hitler has been a subject of study for decades, and according to many historians, Magda was part of a group of Hitler's closest female friends, who he spent a great deal of time with. This also afforded her a royal status in Nazi Germany, placing her as an authority figure, especially among the women. But even though she offered counsel to many of these women about their domestic affairs, her own home was in shambles. Joseph Goebbels had many affairs during the time he was married to Magda, and some of them were even public. In 1936, he became entangled with a Czech actress known as Lida Barova, and by the winter of 1937, their affair had become undeniable to everyone. Magda was obviously not pleased with this, and he had many conversations about it with Hitler. But Hitler was torn between forcing them to break the marriage or keeping them together. However, as the Soviet Red Army entered Berlin in late April 1945, the Goebbels family moved into the Vorbunker, connected to the lower Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery Garden. Seeing the end in sight, Magda wrote a farewell letter to her son, Harold, who had become a prisoner of war in North Africa. With the Nazi Party defeated, the couple knew it was only a matter of time before they and the 6 children with them would be captured. But if they didn't want that to happen, they knew exactly what to do. So on May 1st, 1945, Magda and Joseph injected the children with morphine to render them unconscious. Then they crushed cyanide into their mouths, killing them instantly. After their children died, Magda and Joseph Goebbels walked up to the garden of the Chancellery and took their own lives. Lina Heydrich, the hangman's wife. Although history speaks more of the men who made up the Nazi Party, there are few women whose impacts on the movement and the war cannot be forgotten so easily. One of such women is Lina Heydrich, the beloved wife of Reinhard Heydrich, who was the head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. It was Lina's older brother Hans, who first joined the Nazi Party and spoke very highly of the budding movement to his sister. On a fateful day in 1929, Lina attended a Nazi Party rally where she heard Hitler speak, and just like that, she was won over instantly. She would later cross paths with Naval Lieutenant Heydrich in 1930 at the age of 19, when she attended a Nazi rowing club ball in Kiel. The two soon became entangled, and by December 1930, they were already engaged. However, the following year, Heydrich was charged with conduct unbecoming to an officer and gentleman for breaking an engagement promise he made to a woman 6 months before he met Lina. That April, Admiral Erich Raeder dismissed him from the Navy, and this devastated him greatly. He was left without a career and had to start from scratch. But his lover, Lina, persuaded him to consider the newly formed SS, where he performed so excellently that he was immediately made the chief of the intelligence service. He and Lina finally tied the knot on December 26, 1931, and their home was blessed with 2 sons and 2 daughters. But by the late 1930s, official duties had gotten so hectic that Heydrich stayed away from home for days, leaving Lina to fend for the children and run the household alone. Recognizing her husband's impact on the running of Nazi Germany, Hitler gifted Lina the county estate of Jungfernbrechen in rural Bohemia. At this estate, she kept dozens of prisoners in forced labor and witnesses say she even physically abused them. The family were eventually chased off the property in April 1945 by the advancing Soviet Red Army. Shockingly enough, though, after the war ended, Lina Heydrich was cleared by the denazification proceedings, and after a long and arduous battle, she even won the right to receive pensions from the West German government. However, Czechoslovakia wasn't so lenient on her, and they slammed her with a life sentence in absentia. Unfortunately, she managed to evade the sentence until her death. Life in the post-war era was tough, especially for those who had strong ties with the Nazi Party. So, in 1965, Lina met Finnish theater director Mauno Manninen while on a vacation in Finland, and decided to marry him just so she could change her last name. Her troubled life finally came to an end on August 14, 1985. Until her dying breath, she maintained that her husband had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Margaret Himler. Being the wife of the man who orchestrated the Holocaust, Margaret Himler was one of the most powerful women of Nazi Germany. Her story began on September 9, 1893, when little Margaret Boden was born in Gonkarzewo near Bromberg. She was born to a respected landowner named Hans Boden and his wife Elfriede, and had 3 sisters and a brother. In 1909, Margaret attended the girls' high school in Bromberg, and as the dark days of the First World War rolled in, she embarked on nursing training. In the concluding days of the war, she served at a German Red Cross hospital, and after the war ended, she ventured into private medical practice, operating and directing a clinic in Berlin. One day, Margaret decided to attend a lecture by Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler, where he met the man himself. The two instantly became mesmerized with each other, and so they remained in contact after the first meeting. To Himmler, Margaret was an ideal woman, and he spoke of his love for her in many letters. The two also shared a whole lot of things in common, including an interest in herbal medicine, excessive neatness, belief in strict domesticity, and a mutual preference for a frugal lifestyle. However, they also had their differences. Margaret was 7 years older, she was a divorcee, and in addition, she was also a Protestant. She was like the perfect cocktail of everything Himmler's Catholic parents would never agree with, and he struggled to introduce Margaret to his family. The two would eventually seal their undying love in July 1928, and not surprisingly, none of his family attended the wedding. However, after what seemed like an eternity, his parents eventually accepted Margaret. When the Nazi Party seized power over Germany in January 1933, the Himmlers moved first to Mollstrasse in Munich, and then to Gmund am Tegernsee, where they bought a house. Since the Nazi Party was in charge now, Himmler spent more time away from the family, leading to serious tension between him and his wife. However, those who knew her described her as a cool, hard woman who showed no warmth or emotions. Although she tried to establish some authority and connection with other Nazi women, she remained unpopular, and many of them rejected her leadership. Her home wasn't in the best position either, as her husband was known to be quite promiscuous. For example, in 1938, Himmler initiated a romantic relationship with his secretary Hedwig Pottas, and they even had 2 sons together. Margaret would later find out about this in 1941, when she and Himmler were already separated, sealing the death of her marriage forever. As for her role in the Second World War, Margaret operated a military hospital affiliated with the German Red Cross, and by December 1999, she had become the Grand Supervisor of all Red Cross hospitals in Military District 3, encompassing all areas between Berlin and Brandenburg. Thanks to her extensive work, Margaret reached the rank of colonel in the German Red Cross, and she remained a big fan of her husband and his efforts in the Second World War. After the war ended, though, she was arrested by the United States troops and held in various internment camps across Italy, France, and Germany. During her interrogations, She confessed that she had no knowledge of her husband's activity, which was strange for a high-ranking wife of the Nazi Party. No matter how many times she was questioned, she maintained her stance, and after a long struggle, she was eventually released as a free woman. Her final days were spent with her daughter in Munich, until her eventual death on August 25, 1967. No matter how many times she was questioned, she maintained her stance, and after a long struggle, she was eventually released as a free woman. Her final days were spent with her daughter in Munich, until her eventual death on August 25, 1967. Unity, Mitford, Hitler's stalker. Not all notable women in Nazi Germany were wives. Some, like Unity Valkyrie Mitford, managed to access Hitler's inner courts through intense obsession and constant stalking. Although she was born a British noble and even had ties with Winston Churchill, Unity was an outspoken fascist who was obsessed with Adolf Hitler. In many ways, it seemed she was destined to become a Nazi from the very start. As a child in a large aristocratic family, Unity struggled to distinguish herself from her 6 other siblings. But instead of trying to be the prettiest, cleverest, or the most successful, she chose to align with Nazi ideologies, stacking her nightstand with National Socialist propaganda. She would often talk about traveling to Germany to meet Hitler, a dream that angered her wealthy parents, who didn't understand why their well-behaved daughter had suddenly turned to fascism. To express her internal rebellion, Unity would also drive around with swastika pendants on her car, while giving the Nazi salute to family and friends. Then in 1933, she packed her bags and headed over to Germany without any plans of ever coming back. After attending an event where Hitler gave one of his infamous speeches, Unity was finally totally hooked. She moved to Munich, began frequenting Hitler's favorite restaurant, and constantly sat a table or two away from the supreme leader. One fateful afternoon, he finally noticed her. Hitler invited her to sit with him, and as the two spoke deeper and deeper, Hitler saw fate in Unity's birthplace of Swastika, Ontario, and her middle name, Valkyrie. They became fast friends, and Unity was so infatuated by Hitler that she kept a record of their meetings, all 140 of them. The affection was not one-sided, though, as Hitler once wrote in a book he gifted Unity, saying, "I am always with you however far away you may be. You are always next to me. I will never forget you." Gradually, Unity established her place in Hitler's inner courts, becoming a regular visitor at the Berghof, his vacation home in the Bavarian Alps. She was even in his private box during the Berlin Olympics, and stuck by his side as he announced the annexation of Austria 2 years later. But not everyone was fine with a British elite allying with the Nazis. Some of Hitler's men accused her of being a spy, and Ava Brown, Hitler's partner, didn't really appreciate that another woman was competing for his attention and winning. She even attempted to take her own life out of jealousy, but Unity remained resolute in her desire to befriend Hitler. The story took a tragic turn when Hitler informed her about his plans to go to war with England, and instead of fleeing like her sister did, she chose to remain in Germany. But as soon as Britain declared war on Germany following the invasion of Poland, Unity became devastated, shattered that her 2 favorite countries were now sworn enemies. So, using a pistol Hitler gifted her, she chose to end her own life in the English Garden in Munich. But unfortunately, she survived and began the biggest ordeal of her life. Once she was found, Unity was taken to a hospital in Munich and then to Switzerland. But when all else failed, she was brought back to her family in England. Because the bullet only lodged in her head and didn't cause enough damage to kill her, she eventually made it out alive. Although she was now a shadow of the charming young woman she used to be, she became extremely childish, as if she'd lost the past few years of her life. Although she didn't recall ever trying to take her own life, she remembered her loyalty to Hitler, and even though she was in England throughout the war, she kept cheering the Nazis on. Her one desire was to give birth to a son named Adolf, but unfortunately, that never happened. Because even though she recovered from her injuries, the bullet in her brain was never removed. In 1948, 3 years after Hitler's death, Unity Mitford developed a severe case of meningitis and died. Briggite Frank, Queen of Poland. When Nazi leader Hans Frank took control of Poland following the outbreak of the Second World War, his wife Brigitte Frank declared herself the Queen of Poland, and her brutal reign was a perfect example of Nazi oppression. Born Brigitte Herbst in 1895 as the daughter of spinning mill owner Otto Herbst and his wife Martha, Brigitte's childhood wasn't the most glamorous. Although her family fared quite well, her father left the wife and kids in tears in 1908 when he took his own life. But in spite of the circumstances surrounding her childhood and early years, Brigitte was very confident and dreamed of a higher standard of living even as a young girl. Fast forward to the early 1920s, and Brigitte found work as a stenographer in the Bavarian State Parliament, and later she even got a role as a secretary at the University of Munich. It was there that she met an anti-Semitic law student named Hans Frank, who would eventually become Hitler's personal legal counsel within the Nazi Party. Unlike most other wives and mistresses in this documentary, Brigitte actually had no interest in National Socialism or Hitler himself, and she never officially became a member of any party. Regardless of this, though, Brigitte enjoyed the attention and respect that came with being Hans Frank's wife, and in October 1939, the family moved into the royal castle of Krakow, the Wawel. As the new Queen of Poland, Brigitte would drive to the ghettos of Krakow and Warsaw in her open Mercedes-Benz, snatching jewelry, furs, and other valuables from the locals who were extremely terrified of the Germans. She became known as the face of oppression and intimidation, but her reign was short-lived. At the end of 1944, she fled with her children from the general government to Bavaria, but her husband wasn't so lucky. While attempting to escape, Hans Frank was arrested in Bavaria in May 1945, and after the Main War Crimes Tribunal found him guilty, he was executed in October 1946. While the rest of his family were hiding in the Schoberhof, liberated Polish forces invaded the premises, forcing Brigitte and her family to stand against the wall, execution style. Luckily for her, though, the invaders lost interest in her execution after they found the wine cellar. She would eventually spend 2 years in Schoberhof until May 1947, when she was sent to the labor and internment camp by the Americans. Later, Brigitte was released from prison in 1948, but the proceeds she gained from the war and her other assets were confiscated by the government, including the hoard she stole from the people. Even though she was later released as a free woman, there was little to nothing left to her name. So Brigitte lived in abject poverty until her death in March 1959. Ilsa Hess. History doesn't record much about Ilsa Hess, the charismatic wife of Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess. But from what we do know, Ilsa was born on June 22, 1900 to a conservative and nationalist family. Her father was the wealthy Dr. Friedrich Pröll, who lost his life in May 1917 during the First World War. Afterwards, Ilsa's mother married an artist named Karl Horn, who was the director of the Bremen Art Museum at the time. In 1921, she joined the Nazi Party for the first time, and then in 1925, she rejoined again after the party was banned. Ilsa's story became interwoven with Rudolf Hess in April 1920, when the two first met in Munich, while she was a student at the University of Munich. From the first day she met Hess, she was drawn to him, although she didn't plan to enter into a relationship at the time. It was Ilsa who introduced Rudolf Hess to Adolf Hitler, and after receiving the Supreme Leader's blessings, the two decided to get married in December 1927. Their first child, Wolf Rudiger Hess, was born on November 18, 1937, to whom Hitler served as a godfather. As the Second World War wrapped up, Ilsa and other wives of the condemned or executed war criminals were arrested and transferred to the internment camp in Augsburg-Göggingen. She would eventually be released on March 24, 1948, and settled down in the Allgäu. Throughout her life, Ilsa remained an unrepentant socialist, and until her death in 1995 at the age of 95, she kept promoting Hitler's ideologies in her books and other publications. Ava Brown. Although she's considered one of the most famous women of Nazi Germany, very few people know the true story of Hitler's wife. Born Ava Anna Paula Braun on February 6, 1912 in Munich, Ava was the daughter of a school teacher and seamstress. She was a middle child in a middle-class family, enjoying a typical childhood and teenage years with major interest in clothes, boys, and makeup. Initially, Ava attended a convent school, but she soon started working as a bookkeeper and assistant at the shop of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. It was at the bookstore that Hitler and the then 17-year-old Braun first met in 1929. Hitler was 40. But in spite of their significant age difference, the two became closely involved after one of Hitler's mistresses took her own life. Unfortunately, though, very little is known about their relationship, since Hitler ordered that their records be destroyed as soon as Nazi Germany came crashing down. While Ava was deeply committed to the relationship, her father wasn't pleased with her choosing a man like Hitler, so the two had to keep their relationship secret. This is why there are generally no public sightings of the two together, even though Hitler was surrounded by many women. Historians also believe she held no influence in Hitler's political decisions, and he basically chose her because he believed she wouldn't challenge his authority. However, being with Hitler was extremely challenging, and on two separate occasions, Ava tried to take her own life. As the days of the Second World War rolled in, she remained generally undisturbed and life carried on as normal. But as soon as the tides turned against the Axis powers, things took quite a different turn. As the door began closing in on Hitler, Ava had the option to flee, but instead she chose to stick by Hitler's side in the Berlin bunker. And together they considered taking their own lives rather than falling into the hands of the enemy. For this show of loyalty, Hitler decided to officially marry Ava, and on April 29, 1945, the couple solidified their union right in the bunker. The following day, April 30, the couple ended their lives, Ava with a deadly poison and Hitler with a shot to the head. According to historical records, both Hitler and Ava's bodies were brought to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery, which had been bombed out by the Allies, and their bodies were burned. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.